Jason, you're already laughing. I don't know what you're laughing about.
It's a secret joke between me and me.
Hey, we're so glad to be back with you guys. Conversations, third one. It feels weird saying third conversation because we've been having conversations for a year, but I guess this is the third one that we've done with cameras on us. I don't know who suggested this first. I want to blame William. I'm not sure, but usually you're the one to blame. Yeah. But you said one day, we should just record these. And so I thought, man, that's actually a pretty good idea. And then, of course, with everything that began happening in the country, not for the first time, but it just was more public, probably because of the pandemic and nothing else to focus on, which is actually a good thing, I think, in the end, right? And so the idea of kind of getting on camera and talking was very appealing. So anyway, I'll give you credit either way. I appreciate you pushing forward on that and for all three of you guys being willing to do it. So third one, the first one, they're all on our Facebook page. So the first one really introduced this idea of what does it look like just to have conversations about race? Like, can you even do that? And so that was really what we did for the first one. The last one, their second conversation, I really enjoyed it. I got to do a lot more just sitting and listening, but you each told a lot of your stories. And I hope that the people who watched it, or if you haven't seen it yet, if you go back and watch it, I hope everybody was grateful and maybe a little bit taken aback by it. Because when we talk about, Jason, you just talking about, being arrested for things or just the things that you've experienced that I think it's easy for someone like me to take for granted because I haven't experienced those things. So we kind of left the end of the conversation a bit like in the pool. We said that this is an illustration where we were in the kiddie pool for week one. We got in the shallow end, but then that shallow end has that little slippery part that you slide down into the deep end, and we were about to slide down at the end of last one. And so we're going to go ahead and slide all the way into the deep end, which I appreciate you guys being willing to do that. We have been talking about these two topics for a long time, so these aren't new topics for us. So tonight, we're going to talk through two big topics that are heated topics that are up for a lot of opinions, a lot of debate, some informed, some maybe not as much, right? So we're going to talk about systemic racism, and we're going to talk about privilege, but not just white privilege. We're going to talk a lot about it though, but just the idea of privilege in general and how it does play out, in race. And so, to get us started, here's what I would like to maybe talk through with the systemic racism piece first. Let's talk about that first. If that okay with you guys, we do that first. There are a lot of things in the history of our country that I think every person, no matter what your race, would say was not appropriate, was horrific. There's plenty of things that we would all agree on in that. I think that where a lot of people, and definitely like me for a long time in my life, didn't understand is how things in our past history could still be affecting us today. I mean, I know that's true personally. I mean, when there's an abuse in your history, it affects you today, right? But how is it possible that the, history of the United States, I mean, this is the United States, right? So how is it possible that the history is still having such a dramatic effect on the Black community? Now, William, you gave an incredible illustration about this, and we didn't really get to dig into it in the second conversation. Do you mind kind of giving us that illustration again? And we'll just kind of jump off from there, if that's cool. So
Absolutely. So I said last time that we were together just what this kind of United States experiment looks like is like the game of Monopoly when you go around. Basically, the Black experience from our vantage point has been for about 350 turns. I went around the board and my counterparts went around the board, and everything that my counterparts collected during those turns, they got to keep. And then everything that I collected, they got to keep as well.
Yeah. So
you
you and me are playing.
Correct. You and I are
in the game. You and I are playing the game.
Yes.
And we both went around 350 times, but every time we passed go, I got the $200.
Correct.
And you got $200.
But I gave it to you.
But I got it.
Correct.
Yep.
And then for the last 51 years or so, I've been able to now finally start to buy certain things, but because of certain policies or redlining or discrimination based on where you can live and income deficiencies, I was able to buy maybe the Baltics, the Mediterraneans, the Orientals, maybe even St. James. I started to turn the corner a little bit. But you were the ones who were able to buy the Park Place, the Boardwalks, the Pacifics, the Pennsylvania Avenues. So it's just like a game where we're so far behind, and people now say well, William, it's 2020. There's no discrimination.
Now
Figure it
when you
out.
pass go,
Now.
you get the 200.
Yeah. So we should be on the same playing field.
Theoretically.
Theoretically.
Yeah.
And while I don't disagree that we, for the most part, do have the same ability now to work hard and progress, I think I'm a public, perfect example of that. Steve, Jason, some of the guys that I know, we're definitely great examples. But like you said, our past and what happened for those 350 turns and then the 50 more turns around the board has made it so that we're so far behind that we can't catch up, especially when it comes to wealth gap or when it comes to policy creation, when it comes to healthcare, education reform, things like that.
So one thing I know that you guys have shared, it really has helped me understand this more, is I love that illustration. It just feels so appropriate because I think the problem is, and this, we're going to get to this in the second topic more, but I think one of the key problems in understanding this, for me, as just a white man, one of the key problems for me understanding it is when I was going around the monopoly board, or my generational lineage was, right? My great-grandparents, my great-great-great-great, when they were going around the board, and all those things are wealth's being accumulated, not for everyone. And there's plenty of people who didn't accumulate wealth too, right? But when that wealth was being accumulated, when opportunity was maybe being accumulated, it's hard to see opportunity like that in the mirror. And so it's hard, I think, for someone like me to naturally see that you were going around the board too, but the game wasn't being played the same way. Because when I'm benefiting from it, it's hard to imagine everybody isn't. So I think that's part of it. So
especially when you're working hard.
Yeah,
Because you're still working hard.
Yeah, it's not like I didn't. It didn't like I wasn't rolling the dice and working to get around the board.
Absolutely.
Because we're not taking anything away from that. So, okay, so let's talk about the history. We could go back a long, long way. I mean, we could go back like Adam and Eve long way. I mean, the minute people had a chance to take advantage, we started taking advantage. I mean, so we're not going to go back that far. In our country, how far back do we need to go to talk about the systemic institutional piece
In our country, I would say 1619 is a good starting point.
Okay, why 1619?
That's when the first slave ship carrying African cargo landed in America, which was probably about 30 miles from where I was born, in Virginia.
Can I actually say something really quick?
Sure.
Even you saying that, I think it should cause a lot of people like me to pause for a minute. I know a lot of dates about our country. That's not a date I know about. And I should, but I don't because I haven't had to.
Right.
So, I mean, automatically there's something happening that feels institutional almost,
And
Plus, I mean, a date like that, you have to think about it. I mean, most African Americans don't have the ability to see what their culture was and what their heritage was. That's the date that every last one of us can at least go back to that point, right? I don't have a great-great-great-great-grandfather who was, whatever in Europe or whatever, wherever. I mean, I have them, but I don't necessarily have the ability to actually trace back to it. So people of color, especially African Americans, know that date because that's kind of where it started. From a American experiment standpoint, where we were introduced into it, that's kind of where it started.
Well, let's start there. So I'm going to let you guys talk through this. I'm not the expert in this, but I want to be a learner and be a student.
I wouldn't consider myself an expert.
Well, that's a bad word for it. But if we start with slavery, that's where kind of institutional, systemic racism begins.
Right.
So how is that playing out? Like, that gives way, but it isn't a few years. It takes a long time.
So slavery went through a lot of different changes. So from 1619 until about, I would say, mid-1600s, maybe 1650, around then, it wasn't necessarily illegal to be free and black. You had some Africans that owned slaves here in America. But once sharecropping got to where whites couldn't keep track of the people who were escaping, because you had Europeans, like blacks weren't the only slaves. We had, Irish slaves, I'm sure you know that, Dutch slaves. So as people started escaping, we had to find a way, the government had to find a way to kind of secure their assets. So you came up with insurance companies, and insurance companies would insure human lives. So to minimize loss, you made it illegal just to be black one day. You could wake up, you had a family, you could be married to a white person, have biracial kids, and once that law was enacted, then that was it. Life changed for you in that one moment. And American history is full of these just snapshot moments where black life changed overnight. And we had to come back and find some kind of sense of normalcy within that change, because if you don't, you'll go crazy.
Right.
Well, I think that's a wonderful example of when we use the word systemic or institutional, that it really is institution putting in place something that worked against the Black community.
Absolutely.
And so that was in the very beginning. I mean, bringing people over as slaves is obviously one of those, but it wasn't the only one. Right. It wasn't like that ended and everything became even in that moment.
Right. It really, the systemic portion of it is really dictated by the dollar. Wherever crops were and wherever you would see the most benefit, most efficiency, that's kind of what dictated what system you put into place in order to control your assets or your property.
But and even, I mean, I would say, we think about it, the concept of race didn't exist prior to that point.
No.
There was no...
In the world.
A white person that we call today, you weren't a white person. You were, I'm from Scotland, I'm from Britain, I'm from wherever. Even, and Jason mentioned it last time, there wasn't just Black people. I mean, that's why even the Africans that were on the boat couldn't communicate to each other because they were from different countries. So all of a sudden, you come to this point where some of those snapshots that Jason is talking about, you come to this point and finally people say, we need to institute something that separates very easily the inferior from the superior, whoosh, race. And now the entire concept of race comes. Now there are Black people and there are white people, and somehow that race in and of itself is racist in its bottom form, because it didn't exist until you were able to now say there's one race that's superior and there's one race that's inferior, and because of that, that's now immediately how we can shift from Scotland, shift from Britain, shift from
Nigeria,
wherever.
Ethiopia, South Africa,
Exactly.
you name it.
Into Black and white.
And within that, you had poor whites, wealthy whites, but they were still whites. And the thing is, you could earn yourself into whiteness by sloughing off your old traditions and practices. So Italians are now white. Polish are now white because they adapted to white American culture.
Yep. That is a fascinating piece of this conversation, that because something eventually was deemed superior, which automatically, it's a binary conversation. You can't have a superior without an inferior. Right. So the minute something became superior, something has to become inferior, and everything gets lumped into one of two categories. Which, doesn't it feel like that is a little bit of the human nature, to categorize, to divide for your own benefit, Like, creating unity is actually the most beneficial way. But it doesn't feel that way because of our sin nature and our greed nature. So we think that dividing is what gains us more. Right. So therefore we divided. Right. And we created superior and we created inferior. And it is a wonderful point that lots of other people were slaves of different nationalities, different countries, but their skin color eventually has allowed them to move out of that. Right. Or out of the history, the systemic history of it. Yep. Okay, so slavery is happening. We get to the end of that. I don't want to go too fast, but I don't want to, But so we get to the end of that, but it isn't the end of institutional or systemic.
Right? Well, technically, even with the end of slavery, it wasn't the end of slavery.
I know. I feel weird even saying the word end because we know that isn't how it.
There was a emancipation signed, and I think even very well-intentioned, good-natured, good-hearted people who said, I got crops, and I got a bunch of them. And I got a lot of land that needs to be tilled, and I can't afford to hire because it's going to eat my profits. So they said, well, even though there's been a decree that says slavery is over, if they can't read and they don't know, they're just going to think this is business as usual.
Even with that being said, it's like today, if we have to take care of our families, in order to avoid being uncomfortable for a little while, we will do whatever we have to do to justify our means, right? So, like you said, if we have crops, and it would behoove me to keep people working those fields so that my children and my wife can maintain this same lifestyle that they've been living, then that comes before my duty to mankind, which is crazy. But it's very nearsighted, but that's how it is.
Right. Well, it's just a broken world, though.
Right, right.
So slavery theoretically, legally ends, but it doesn't really end.
Correct.
What happens now? I mean, there's about 4 million, black slaves in the South that are legally emancipated, but it isn't that simple.
No.
And then, I mean, you think about it. So there's still the class system, right? So there's still blacks now are still at the bottom of the totem pole with everything. So and there was a clear separation. So even finally, when Juneteenth happens and truly the last people are told, well, think about this. What do you do when I can imagine it in my head when the master comes out and says, hey, you know what? All y'all, you're now free. Well, what does that mean? Where am I going to go? What am I going to do? I can't get land, right? I can't get a job because the people that were the ones that released me are the ones that have the jobs. So
and make the laws that
exactly.
Yeah.
So what am I supposed to do? And a lot of those slaves turned around and they went right back to the field.
Sharecropping. Yeah.
Why? Because that's all they knew. And then sharecropping started. It was home.
Yeah.
Sharecropping then started the debt system, if you will, where they couldn't get out of that. And then it goes even better, where then you get to a place where, okay, if there were certain laws that were then put in place that if you didn't have a job, it was only for black males.
Right.
If you didn't have a job, then they could arrest you for not having a job.
And
then
free
that
work.
person that arrests you, the person who didn't give you a job, wouldn't let you have a job, who maybe you didn't like the terms of the sharecropping, whatever, so now they're getting you out of the ability to get a job, they now arrest you and put you back in the same place that you just were out of
as prison labor.
As a prison labor, right?
Yep.
So it's that cycle then just starts. So even though, yes, legally they were free, the hearts of men hadn't changed.
Well, we could even just pause there, and the argument is racism, systemic, institutional in our country. Case in point, it's proven.
Correct.
Yeah.
I mean, that alone, the fact that we're going to say you're free, but you have to have a job. If you're white, you can or you can't. It doesn't matter. We're fine with it. But if you're black and you don't have a job, we will arrest you because we still need labor.
Correct.
And now this is our new legal way of working the system.
That's a finesse.
That's the loophole in the 13th Amendment itself.
Correct.
Yeah.
It says that slavery is illegal
that.
except
Yeah.
for
Yep.
servitude through, if you're found guilty of a crime, we can put you to use. And that is the whole reason for that loophole.
It is, because then you're able to say, well, let's just find some reasons.
Yeah,
Right.
They
And
made
second,
vacancy laws,
right.
truancy laws.
Right.
Those type of laws were put in place.
Right.
And then it comes down again to taking care of your family. If you were on patrol, and these weren't people who had police academy training, these were people who were just out with a gun and manning the roads, and if you didn't report a black person who was truant, who was out after dark without a job or whatever, you didn't report them, that would be equivalent today to having to pay $30,000.
Right.
Now think about that. Your family takes a $30,000 hit because you didn't blow the whistle on somebody.
You're going to blow the whistle.
I hate to even get ahead, but I think it's still that mentality where we feel like we have to show our papers.
For sure.
When we're asked, why are we here? Or
sure.
how did you get here? Or how can you afford to be here? Or, why are you in this neighborhood? Or what are you doing tonight? Where are you headed? It's almost the same concept. I've got to show you. Yes, master. This is where I'm headed.
You have
This
to
is where I'm
validate
going.
your presence.
I don't think that's even getting ahead. That's the whole thing we're talking about is the fact of, well, what happened way back then still have impact today?
Same system.
And because again, the hearts of men haven't changed.
Well, and we
they
know
pass it on.
that our personal histories affect us today.
Absolutely.
Sure.
I mean, ask anyone who's ever been abused, who's ever been oppressed, is a word we would use for some of this conversation. Ask anyone who grew up in a situation where they, maybe they were just dirt poor.
Right.
That has affected them. And it still is affecting them because we're broken. We can't move past it all alone. We can't, on this side of eternity, move past that.
Right.
So I guess it probably would be very naive for someone to say, it happened a long time ago, come on.
Yeah.
But we were slaves for longer than we've been free.
Right.
One of you guys said, I think it was the very first one, and I all of a sudden paused and thought, I mean, you guys are living as the first generation
Jason, yep.
in civil rights, with civil rights since birth.
And as I was saying that, that's something I hadn't verbalize before, but as I'm saying it, it's landing on me.
Wow.
And this light goes off and this weight falls on me at the same time. And it's like, in real time, I'm realizing that we're closer than we thought.
Correct.
Because I have family lineage that wasn't, you know, they didn't have it all together. I mean, there's some junk in my family tree. You know, there's some knots and some weird limbs in it, you know, but there are elements of my family tree that you don't have and that I will never experience, you know? So the fact that my father was born with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness by default.
Yeah.
And then your parents weren't. Yet they were still living under the same declaration and the same Constitution.
Yeah.
You know, so let's talk about the civil rights piece then, and or I mean, we can just talk about. I mean, you guys take it where you want, but
if you go back even to the Monopoly analogy, so even when Black people got a chance to go around, I would buy the Baltic, I'd buy the Mediterranean, you know, I'd buy the things that I'm trying, and then you had things like the Black Wall Street Massacre, where they would take our cities of wealth and burn them down.
Drop bombs on them.
Bringing bombs into, and I mean, this is history that can be read. That's been suppressed and quieted.
Yeah, we're not making this stuff up.
We're not, and the sad thing is we talked about Juneteenth. That's something I just started celebrating 4 years ago. I wasn't aware of a Black man that 1619 was my date.
Yeah.
You know, I you know, even with the Black Wall Street and how that was massacred and how we had tremendous wealth. I wasn't aware of that till about 6 or 7 years ago. But there were pockets of our culture where we went around the board, we saved, we worked hard, we persevered, and we said, we're going to establish a new currency, a new belief system, a new value system for ourselves. And it was completely interrupted.
But and that's what I think.
And interrupted over and over.
Well, that's exactly that's where, you know, when you hear the message of, well, you know what, you all have the same opportunities, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and then you say, well, hold up, we've done that. I mean, to even think that for a people that started as slaves could get to a point where someone could even become a president of the United States that has that heritage. Oh, no. We've in many ways pulled ourselves up from our bootstraps, but make no mistake, as we're pulling ourselves up, it's like every time you pull yourself up, the rule just changed. And now it's like, well, because the rule changed, now I got to pull myself up differently. Rule changes again because we don't control the rules, and because we don't control the rules, and all of a sudden, because what happened? You think about it. There's the two classes, right? And the biggest bump has been because the African Americans after slavery, there was no thought that you were going to get up to Rockefeller level. No one never even thought that. But the thought was, hold up, maybe I can get up to the low to mid white people, I can kind of get to that point, and then it caused problems there. And so there was that line of resistance where that ceiling was like, no, you got to get back down. And no, I got to show you this. Okay, you're Black Wall Street, y'all are doing well, I got to get you back down. Yeah. I mean, even things like, you hear pulled up by the bootstraps in terms of education, right? So when it comes to education, well, literally, the thing that people said is going to be the key for you to be able to be better for yourself, we were denied. Literally denied. I mean, that's why these historically Black colleges and universities, they didn't come up because we just all had an idea.
It wasn't at a Black pride.
This would be cool. You know what? College of people. You know, Wakanda forever. It wasn't any of that.
Wakanda forever.
It was literally, we were like, well, we don't have any options. So we're going to go to this. And then you started having successful people come out. And then what happens is now all of a sudden, even in corporate America, and this is further back, now they say, okay, well, we want people from certain schools. Well, these are schools that Black people couldn't get. They were, not that they weren't smart enough to get in, they were not allowed to get into these schools. And so all these things, again, the rule changes, the line in the sand got moved back a little bit more, And so it causes that systemic problem.
See, I wanted to go to Morehouse. Coming out of high school, I mean, that was, for me, was like a big deal. I wanted to go to Morehouse. I wanted to go to an HBCU. And I called my cousin. I won't say her name. She may be watching, but I called her and I told her, I said, I think I'm about to get accepted. I'm waiting for this letter. And she said, William, if you go there, that's another notch that they can say, nope, you have no culture. You have no diversity.
You won't fit in here.
You won't fit in, so we can't hire you. So I couldn't go to a
You don't want to give another reason.
Because I didn't want to give another reason for them to say, William, nope.
To use your Monopoly illustration, we're going to keep using it. I probably will forever because I just really like it. But it's almost like 50 years ago, now as a black man, you're able to play the game like everybody else. But the person who created the game controls the rules.
Right.
Correct.
And they can change the rule whenever they want
Correct.
to benefit them.
Correct.
Right.
And I don't want to come across as like, how dare they? Because I think I probably have the propensity and do this too. I think it's sin nature that we operate out of greed.
Yeah.
All of the things that we're talking
Self-preservation.
about are selfish and greed driven, economic driven. So slavery was, Jim Crow was,
Also on top
education
of
was.
that, the fatal flaw that we seem to run into every time we start to make progress is the illusion that this is an individual game. That these gains are all independent of one another, that your success is your success. Nobody else can benefit from your success. And I think we aren't meant to function as individuals.
Yeah, like there's like one pot of gold.
Exactly.
And if I give up any of mine to you, then I don't get it. You know, and that's not how this works.
And I think that's why some people they feel like you're discrediting their productivity or their accomplishments. But you aren't. I think they're functioning under the pretense that everything they've done is solely because of them. It's the work they've put in.
Yeah.
Nobody else has, especially people who grew up underprivileged, which is understandable. I mean, if we weren't underprivileged, we had friends and family that were. So to say that nobody else had anything to do with my success, that would be ridiculous, preposterous. But we have to understand that together, like God meant for us to be, we function at a much higher level.
Right.
And it doesn't take away from our resources, it adds.
So and we've talked through this so much together, so I feel almost too comfortable with it, but I know the majority of people watching, this might not be, old hat information. This may be very new in a way. And I think our propensity, because mine is too, is when I hear new information that I'm not sure I agree with, I kind of want to stiff arm.
Yeah.
And I think it is easy to hear some of the things that we talk about and think, I'm not sure it's quite the way that you're selling it to me. But I do think that facts are really tricky little boogers, aren't they?
Yeah.
Because you can't dispute the reality of facts. And so it is a fact that emancipation gave way to a new law that created a new version of slavery. It just was called something different.
Right.
That's a fact. It's a fact that in our educational system, you've helped me, Jason, you've talked about this with me, that our educational system, when you study U.S. history, it is not presented holistically. That's why we didn't learn about some of these dates that we've talked about, 1619, Juneteenth. That's why I heard about that a week and a half ago, right? We could talk, I'm going to get to the next topic too, so I don't want to spend 3 hours on this one, but we could talk about segregation. Those are legal realities, right? Redlining. We could talk about, there's all sorts of real estate things that were created.
When it comes to, not to cut you off, Gavin,
No.
when it comes to, I don't think all, privilege is just economic, but that's a decent-sized slice of the pie, I'd say. But if you look at how wealth creation for most people happens, it's by owning something, having that something, and seeing profits in that.
Letting it grow in value.
Correct.
Right.
And then passing it on and parlaying.
That's the key.
And when we were told that we couldn't live in certain neighborhoods, when they would draw literally red lines around certain districts and says, no,
See,
black people need to live here.
I don't know that everyone knows that actually happened.
And see, the thing is, we have to, well, not we, the stuff we know, but the tricky thing about not knowing what you don't know is that you don't know what questions to ask. You don't know how to figure out what you don't know. So I encourage people to go out and seek that information. We have more information at our fingertips.
Well, it's all available now. It's easy.
Right. So if you're not looking for it, then you're just willingly being ignorant to reality, to what is happening.
See, I've told you guys, I grew up in Riverdale for the first 15 years of my life, moved one county down to Fayette County my sophomore year, before my sophomore year. I grew up in a middle school, high school environment where I was more in a minority as a white, kid there. But I never felt uncomfortable with that. I think probably because everywhere I looked, television, whatever, it was white dominated. So it just didn't make me feel that uncomfortable. I moved one county away and there were no black people. And I remember walking into school the first day and looking around, and it kind of freaked me out a little bit because it just looks so white. It looks so different, And so if I thought, so back in Riverdale where I came from, I thought, well, I guess all the black people live in Riverdale together because they just like living together. There's a cultural thing. There's reasons behind. They're choosing to do this.
No.
What I think you guys have helped me understand is while there is some choice involved, I mean, sure, it hasn't always been a choice. And so the fact that there were, I mean, when we use the word systematic, institutional, it's the legal things that were created. So like the redlining. I mean, you even just talked about this recently. I mean, the word master bedroom, where that came from, which I never thought about.
I didn't know that until I saw it on CNN the other day. Let me turn this mess off.
Right.
So if I'm a slave, oh, that's the master's bedroom.
Which you don't hear that now. I don't think you guys hear that now and you feel oppressed by the word. But it is a reminder that it is just a part of our fabric.
But you know what? The fact that I didn't know that was blissful to me.
Correct.
It's like some stuff you didn't know.
Yes.
Now that I know it, that's another burden.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't want to know that stuff.
Here's the key.
Ignorance is bliss.
It is.
Which is why we don't want to learn.
Absolutely.
But that's what systematic is all about.
Right.
It's about the fact that something is
Make it.
instituted overtly at some point in the past, and it just stays there, and it becomes so transparent that all of a sudden we now accept it as the cultural norm, right? That's what systemic
That's
is.
kinda like the
we're not
monuments
trying
and
to-
this
So
stuff,
now,
yeah.
10 generations later, the 10th generation is like, well, hold up, I'm not being racist. It's just my master bedroom.
Right.
Because my mom called it that, and my grandma called it that, and they called it that.
And they don't mean anything by
And they
it.
truly are not
Exactly.
being racist. But it doesn't change the fact that the underlying reason that it was even called that was based on something that was truly racist in and of itself, right? And so that's what all it is with the redlining, with the laws. I mean, again, you have big financial institutions that even right now have lost lawsuits for doing some of the exact same practices that were during redlining. I mean, we're talking about big brand names that everyone would know if I said the name. They're losing lawsuits for that because of some of the stuff that was overt racism at the time that it got put into practice, but then over time, it just now became socially accepted.
And we were talking about something earlier, not to cut you off, Steve.
You're good.
Something here that you decided wasn't worth causing your brother or sister to stumble. Like, is it really worth it to change one word in our dialect, if like a master bedroom? I have no problem calling it a main bedroom or whatever. But something like that, if it negatively impacts a group of people, why not do away with it?
Well, we don't, okay, I want to move to the next topic, but really quick on that one. I think that this is where the Jesus follower has to think differently and think better and live a life worthy of the calling they've received.
Right.
Because, Jason, when you say that, I think the natural tendency for everyone, at least who's white, is to say, hey man, put your big boy pants on and stop being so sensitive. It's just a word, it's an adjective for the bedroom. No one means it racist, right? But if it matters to you and it doesn't matter to me, and I'm a Jesus follower, I think I've missed it.
Right.
And that's been one of the things that has been so eye-opening for me, and you guys have been so gracious over the last year to help me ask questions and let me learn and listen and you know, say the wrong stuff at times and all that. But I think I just got to a point where I thought, if I'm really gonna be serious about following Jesus, I have to care about things that you care about. Because God cares about the things that I care about, and I'm called to love you the way He has first loved me. And if it matters to you, it has to matter to me.
But that was Paul's message, right?
It's
Where he was
all,
like-
yeah,
he was like,
it's
"Look,
the New Testament
absolutely,
ethic.
Yeah.
absolutely.
It's the New
So
Testament
would you
ethic.
say then ultimately your opinion of us maybe has changed or shifted, or maybe your thought processes have changed?
My opinion of you hasn't changed because I was blessed to know most of you first, so I had an unfair advantage. But, you know, and if you serve in transit, I have an automatic very high opinion of you. You know, if you're volunteering in our church, man, you and I, we're good. So, but what has changed is how much I've realized I didn't know. I've realized how much what my unknowing has accidentally hurt others by. Not overtly, never overtly. I hope not. But I've realized that by choosing to remain ignorant about it, I was choosing not to love people as well as I could.
Right.
because I can't stand with someone if I don't understand them. I can't love them well if I don't understand them. I mean, this is why we love to find out the personality profile of our spouse, because, or love languages. You know, when I find out my wife's love language is quality time, I'm going to try to be more intentional about spending time with her. So if I find out there's certain things that I am doing as a white person that is hurtful, I should care about that. And my response is probably going to be, hey, you got to get over it. But I have to catch that response and realize that that's sin in me that's saying that. And I need to put other people first. Okay, no more preaching. Let's talk about the big word that is a bombshell, the word privilege.
Ooh.
The word privilege. You guys have actually brought it up. The word has come up a few times already. The word privilege, and before we jump too quick to it, all the things that we just talked about, the systemic institutional stuff, I think a lot of it was probably accidental, that had secondary consequences that hurt the Black community, and that maybe wasn't the point of it. I also think there were lots of things that probably that was the point of it. When you go back and look at it and study the true history of it. So I just would encourage anybody who's kind of tuning in, who's curious and wants to investigate. I'm not telling you what to believe by any means. I'm just telling you, I think you owe it to yourself to go read about it and find out for yourself.
And to clarify, this has nothing to do with political leanings. It has nothing to do with any of that. This is just basic humanity. This has nothing to do with...
But I think by understanding the history, it helps me understand your perspective. And that's where empathy begins. And I can't empathize and love someone if I don't know where you're coming from. So I think that's why it's at least worth it to do it. As a Jesus follower, right? Okay, so privilege. The minute I used the word white privilege in a sermon I did about 1.5 years ago, I got some really fun emails from that. Ironically, several people who on social media lit me up, who know me personally and have my phone number, and felt more comfortable blasting me publicly on social media than just calling me and asking me if I'd go have coffee and have a deeper conversation. It was very frustrating. But I also understand that word has been weaponized and politicized for the benefit of the people who are doing it. So when we talk about privilege, we could use the word advantage. There's all sorts of words we could use for that. Let me read 2 things that have been posted on social media recently on ours. And I just assume if you posted on the Woodstock City social media, you're okay with everybody hearing it. So, white privilege. White privilege is a lie. I didn't, and no one I know has ever benefited from this made-up propaganda. It's a lie that belittles the effort of anyone who has made something of their life professionally. A falsehood to push a narrative that suggests that if you have earned something in your life, then you should feel guilty for that. Who would believe that, and what kind of person would promote that kind of narrative? So, now I think it's only fair to say I was able to figure out, I know that person who wrote that. And I found them in the community one day and asked them about it, and the person could not have been more gracious. And said, I would love to sit down with coffee and talk more about it and have a deeper conversation. And I think for both sides. So they could hear more about what I'm wondering and thinking, and so I can equally hear what they're feeling, about that. So I read that to say, because I think that's a person who stated it, I think they're not in the minority when they wrote that.
I don't know. Part of me says, for just a second, let's not even consider race for a second.
Okay.
And I know that me as let's talk male privilege for a second, gender, just that 100% privilege advantage that is given based on the X and the Y chromosomes that you are born with, right? And I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, I have worked incredibly hard for everything that I have. I've busted my tail. I have overcome overt discrimination. I have overcome some systemic discrimination, and I'm still overcoming it, right? I'm not like some grand person, but nonetheless, I've overcome and I've busted my tail. But statistically, women in this world have been more educated than men since the 80s, 1980s, meaning they have more bachelor's degrees, more master's degrees, more doctorates. And women are working just as hard. right? So the question I had to ask myself is, why is it that my female counterparts, again, putting race aside for a second, because if you add race and you talk about black women per capita, it's even
yes, it is worse. But
if I say, why is it that women that my average counterpart is making about 80% of what I'm making, meaning we've been in the business for the same amount of time, we have similar education. In fact, they have more education than I do, right? They're working just as hard. So either I have to say that there's some sort of systemic problem, or something that gives me an advantage, or I have to say, no, women just are lazy. They need to pull themselves up. They're not working as hard as I am.
Yep.
I'm the one that's out there.
They don't deserve it as much.
They don't deserve it.
Right.
And here's where I know that's not the case. It's because there's been several times where I've been at a conference or I've been in some business meeting where we have a lot of executives that are there and we're talking as a whole. So there's women, there's men, all ethnicities, whatever. And then we have a break. Everyone goes to their restrooms, and we continue to have certain business conversation in the male restroom. Yeah. The women are not even allowed to in that party. Mm-hmm. There's business deals that I've done in the restroom while washing our hands and getting stuff. Sometimes while you're still standing in front of the urinal.
I don't want to talk about that.
That can go.
You get my point.
Totally
is that there's an advantage by the fact that I went into the right restroom. There was an advantage I had that split second that I was able to close a business deal or to just develop some rapport during the break that my woman counterpart, who worked just as hard as I did, who has just as much education as I have, who has done just all the right things.
But on average, is being paid 75% as much.
Exactly.
And if I was a woman and I knew that were true, I would be livid about that reality.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I would wonder, why are the men ignorant to it?
Correct.
And the reason, I guess, is because we don't typically pay attention to the things that aren't working against us.
That's correct.
Right.
And we're just ignorant to the things that are working for us.
That's correct.
And sometimes we maybe take too much credit for our hard work. When, I mean, I could do that, as a white male. I mean, a white male born in this country without, poor parents. I got all the things working in my favor. And it doesn't mean I didn't work hard, though.
Correct.
Right.
And it doesn't mean I haven't, done a lot of things to better myself and improve. I think it does mean that I didn't have a few other things that were working against me. For instance, gender wasn't working against me.
Correct.
But sexism and racism have some very similar things to it.
Absolutely.
And if we believe in one, I think that we have to believe in both.
You have to. I mean, you can't say that, yes, we understand that there needs to be, there are things that women have to deal with in the workforce that just me as a male, I've never had my boss hit on me. Just never. It's never happened, right? I mean, I'm not as pretty
you're
as
a good-looking
William,
dude, though, but I'm surprised by that, actually, but okay.
But it's never happened, right? I've never, all those things, I've never had someone say certain things to me or suggest that I need to go handle my kids or I need to go be home to cook dinner for my wife. I've just never, and I don't think about it.
And
I don't think about it.
So
that's the same thing.
I think, and just before we get off of the racial part, before we get too far away from it, I think white privilege is just not ever having to think about race.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's the
Which
privilege.
I think is important. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, I mean, somebody asked me the other day, William, why do you always see things in terms of race? And I said, that's part of what privilege is the fact that you don't have to.
Yeah. Right.
And I do.
Right.
I'm always wondering, is that why I didn't get promoted? Because I know I work hard. I know I was in the right meetings. I went to the right school, maybe. Yeah. But I wonder those things. Is that why I got followed in the store? Is that why someone shifted a little bit around me? Is it because am I not dressed right, or am I making them uncomfortable? Is it my color? I mean, I literally have to think those.
And once you acknowledge that, so for example, with sexism, once you acknowledge that, would you take money from your paycheck to make it right? And would you be able to get everybody on board to do that? Would you willfully give up something of yours to make it right? And I would argue that some people have a hard time.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's a hard thing.
Well, we talked about that. So people, the word privilege makes people uncomfortable, but I can acknowledge that I have privilege. As even a black male, I have certain privilege and certain things I would not give up. I've worked my tail off to keep my kids in the school systems they're in the neighborhoods that we're in, around the community of people I want to be around. And I don't want to go to what may be the opposite, or what maybe some of my other counterparts who haven't either worked as hard or haven't had the opportunities that I've had.
You know the key there though is that I would differentiate you working hard from privilege. I don't believe you have privilege. I believe your kids have privilege.
That's true.
And that's the difference, right?
That is
because you've had to bust your tail for the things that you've gotten. Your kids just benefit from it because they were born
from your hard work.
That's true.
Because they were born to you and your wife, they immediately benefit from it. And the same thing is true. And that's where the advantage comes because it's not anything you did. You just existed.
So the word privilege, I mean, it is such a loaded word, but advantage is the same word. They basically mean the same thing, right? Yep. So it really is just any sort of, privilege is any sort of advantage that is given or available to a particular group of people. That's all it means. Right. So, males have an advantage over females in this country. It shouldn't be, but it is. Mm-hmm. So therefore, that is a privilege. Mm-hmm. So I think what hangs a lot of white people up with white privilege, the word, is, and I hear this so much, and it's valid. I understand why they feel this way. They say, I was born poor. I was born, dirt poor. I worked for everything I had. No one gave me anything. I have earned everything that I have, right? Mm-hmm. Now, part of me as a pastor wants to go, I think you may be removing God from the conversation, but let's just leave him out for a minute. Right. That's very true. And there is a thing called economic privilege. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
But do you feel like sometimes the white population, I know this is hard to ask you guys this as the non-white population because it's harder to hear it from you, but do you think the non-white population equates white privilege to economic privilege and they think they're the same thing?
No doubt.
So therefore they look at you and they say, it's America. Mm-hmm. You can work hard too.
Right.
Yeah. And so therefore there is no privilege. There is no white privilege, there is economic privilege.
Right. And privilege in itself, let's not get caught up on the economic aspect of it. It's a quality of life. It's a quality of living.
See, I think that's really important though, Jason. I think that when we make it an economic conversation only, we miss the point of white privilege.
Absolutely.
It's not an economic conversation.
Right.
It has an economic element like a pie that's chopped up into pieces. Yeah. It's just one of the pieces, but it isn't the only piece, and maybe not even the most important piece.
Right. Yeah.
I'd be willing to know, Jason, when the times when you were talking about getting arrested, did anyone ever ask you your salary? Or ask you how much wealth you have? I know when you were in the store.
Yeah, that one time, but
But typically, do they say, hey, what is your net worth?
Right.
No, of course
not. Of course, because they all of a sudden, the economic privilege just got separated from
the pigment.
The pigment.
Good point.
Pigmentation.
Absolutely.
And so what I don't want is for anyone to say, okay, I'm out at this point because the white privilege thing's a joke. The guy who wrote the tweet, he's right, whatever. I think that there is emotion in it that is accurate. I just think it's a misapplied word.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but what you have to do with that emotion is not turn away from it. That's your opportunity to open that door and actually talk about what we're talking about.
Which is what this person did, which I was incredibly grateful for. So I saw this on Instagram. It went viral. Most people have probably seen it. It was like a white privilege test. But I thought it was a fascinating way to maybe illustrate the reality of something that maybe a person like me by default doesn't want to admit is a reality. So we won't do it the way they did, but I do have 10 quick things. I just want you to raise your hand if it's true of you. So just raise your hand if it's true of you. I'll raise my hand too, okay? Been called a racial slur. Okay? Followed in a store unnecessarily. Multiple times. All right, someone crossed the street to avoid passing you on the street. Okay, clenched their purse on the street or in an elevator. Okay, stepped off of an elevator to keep from having to ride with you. Not sure about that one, right? Okay. Well, that's good. You got one that you haven't. Okay, good. Accused of not being able to afford something expensive. Never been given a pass on a citation that you probably deserved one.
I've been getting passes.
Yeah. See, I think that's a reality. I think there are people who would say yes to that.
Yeah.
However, we've probably all been let go.
Yeah.
Off of things, which I think is that's good.
Not
okay.
Pulled over at all.
Right. And that's true too. Yeah. Stopped or detained by police for no valid reason.
Stopped. Yeah.
Yep. All right. Bullied because of your race.
Maybe.
Well, I feel like you told a story about somebody doing that to you when you were in elementary.
He tried, yeah.
Well,
I'm just saying,
bully doesn't mean they won the fight.
Okay.
The bullied became the bully.
Right. Bully doesn't mean that they won. It just means that they,
Well,
they okay.
Yeah.
All right, last one. Denied service because of the color of your skin. Yeah?
so.
Definitely.
So, can you tell us about that?
Absolutely, yeah. So this is, I was a
Because
teenager.
I have no category for this.
I was a teenager. We were in Reading, Pennsylvania. I remember it very vividly. We went up there for a thing with the church that I grew up in back in Virginia, and we were in a very rural area. I was with my parents, so I mean I couldn't even drive at the time, so I was with my parents, and we stopped. I mean we were hungry and we stopped, and literally I remember my parents walked in. I was right behind them. They walked in, and the manager actually came over and talked to my parents and basically was like, "No, you all can't eat here." And my mom, anyone who knew my mom, she's very outward with her emotions.
I love that you were searching.
Vocal.
Indeed.
She's very clear
And
with how
what made
she's
it worse too, I mean, she was very educated, very articulate. So I can call her articulate.
Yeah.
But she was very.
I've learned I cannot call that.
Very articulate. And so, I mean, so they went back and forth for a while, and I just, like, to this day, I'll never forget the expression on the guy's face as he looked at us in almost disgust, as if we, how dare us try to come into his establishment. And he was the owner, so he said that he had a right for us not to come. And yeah, so.
See, I think, Steve, even, I'm just gonna play devil's advocate. It's just people say, well, you're 12, 13, 14 years old. That's a couple years ago, more than a couple years ago. I can recall a time coming home from Middle Georgia, coming from Columbus, and it was had gone to visit some family and spend some time for Thanksgiving, and got late in the night, so we ended up leaving around 11:30. And when you've been eating all day, hanging out, talking, and you don't want to miss conversation, you don't stop to use the bathroom.
Right.
And because
at
it's
some
family's
point,
house,
that's gonna win.
It's gonna win, and you don't use it in your family's house either, because it's not polite.
All right.
So I decided to wait, and about 20 minutes into the ride, coming up I-185, and this is just a couple years ago, I mean, I had a serious case of.
You needed to go to the bathroom.
I need to use the bathroom.
Help me, please. Help me,
Yes,
please.
it was. I was talking to Jesus, like, let me find something.
Jesus, take
And
the wheel. I need to-
everything's closed. There's nothing, mainstream open, so I can't stop at a Walmart in LaGrange on the way back or something. So I pull off on I-185, and there's a hole in the wall spot. And I go in the front, and there's several patrons, 20, 30 patrons. And none of them look like me, but I didn't initially think that. I just was looking for the bathroom more than anything. And I asked the bartender, I said, ma'am, do you mind if I use you all's restroom? She said, you can go outside to the outhouse and use that one.
They had an outhouse?
They had an outhouse. And, so I used it. But as I'm, just kind of relaying everything in my head, just thinking, I couldn't use their establishment restroom. And it wasn't because I wasn't a paying customer, because I wasn't saying, hey, can I sit here and hang?
Right.
And, obviously I've talked to my wife, and when we got back in the car, she was worried, scared, like, what happened? She said, I was, 2 seconds from coming to see where you were at. But just even things like that.
So you guys both just recently told me about those stories, and I'm glad I didn't hear for the first time here, because it actually makes me sad. It breaks my heart to hear those things, because I think part of it breaks my heart because I just wonder how often I've accidentally treated people poorly for reasons that were so invalid. But I think the other part that really breaks my heart, and I know this is just a pastor, and I get to hear stories all the time, and I see how stories affect people. Like, Steve, you can still picture the exact look on the person's face.
Yep.
Like, that imprinted on you.
Absolutely. I mean, I could, if we had one of the sketch artists, I could describe it to the
And
T.
for the guy who did it, it's
Correct.
one of
doesn't
probably
care.
thousands.
So I think that's the thing about and I know the word is loaded, but white privilege, it matters that we admit that there is such a thing. And it does not mean there aren't other versions of privilege. There are gender-based privileges, there are economic privileges. I mean, there may be a list of 50 different privileges, right? I think that what we have to acknowledge, at least I feel like we have to as a white person, I don't think I am being asked to feel guilty for it. You have never asked me to feel guilty. In fact, you've told me not to.
Right.
You don't want me to feel guilty about it. You don't want me to feel ashamed by it. I think if I understand, I mean, correct me, but I think what you want me to do is just admit that it actually is a thing.
Just acknowledge.
And that's it.
And that acknowledgement is going to go to, that consistent acknowledgement is going to go to a change of heart and a change of actions, right? By me knowing what I know about women being treated differently,
Correct.
And all of a sudden now, like if I'm hiring someone, then and I look at the resumes and it's all men, I'm going back to my HR person and say, surely there's not a single woman that was qualified for this position?
Well, the women one is a perfect example because I feel like it's unfortunate that when you take race out of it, all of a sudden it becomes easier and more clear. But it does. You know, the minute that I discovered, I mean, as a leader of an organization, you know, where we employ women, the minute that I discovered that there were gaps nationally, the first thing I did is go and make sure that we weren't replicating them.
Correct. Correct.
Because I'm not going to lead an organization that treats women differently than men because of their gender. We're not going to do that.
And I think some people see it as weak. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Some people see it as a weakness and a loss of power or culture. For example, we look at the whole Confederate flag debate. People see that as invasive. It's imposing on their rights. And of course, you have the right to do something. But is that the best thing to do?
Yeah, well, what's legal is not often what's moral.
Right.
And I think that's a big distinction we have to always make.
I think you said what we want is for you to acknowledge. And I think one more step beyond that, and I think, Steve, you hit it on the head yesterday when we were talking. You said it's not that necessarily we can change it here, but the way you do things, the way you live and how you handle things is reflected in our kids and the next generation of leaders and future business owners and CEOs who will say, well, there should be no such thing as a gender bias or a racial bias. I never saw that in my household. So when I lead, when I'm in a position of authority, we're not going to stand for that. So I think it goes back to, we may not be able to change it here and today, in the next day or two, or week or two, or a year or two, or a decade or two.
Right.
But if we are in our homes modeling a system that says, look, we are no better. You know, we're equal.
We're all God's creation.
We're God's creation.
In His
everyone,
image. Everyone
actually matters.
That's right.
Then we can, we can change those things generationally.
Well, I want to ask you to repeat this. I'll repeat it, and I think this is very valid. So to take it, I think it is more than just acknowledgement. I saw a person recently say that if the problem could be resolved by the Black community, it would have been resolved a long time ago.
Right.
Yeah.
So I do think that I have a responsibility to do some introspective work and actually discover for myself how much of this is valid and not go into it with so much presupposition that I find what I'm looking for, right? But that I go into it and no matter what my background has been, I'm able to look at it and say, yeah, maybe you three guys had an economic advantage over me, but I have an advantage over you in some ways too, because of the color of my skin. It does create some advantages. And be willing to admit that that is actually a reality in this country.
And don't look at it in such a binary manner. We
No.
used that word earlier.
Right.
There's no good and bad.
Right.
There's so much nuance that we have to really work on.
And then the second thing I think for me, as a white person, is to realize that change has to also include me. Because again, if the Black community didn't need the white community to help, it would already be done.
Right.
So the Black community does need the white community to help, which means that we have to show empathy and we have to be willing to, and I don't want to bring Jesus into it too much, but I'm a pastor and this is a church. When Jesus said, a new command I give you, love others as I have first loved you, like it wasn't a suggestion.
Right.
And so Andy asks this question all the time, and it is the most penetratingly horrible question he has ever asked. What does love require of you?
That's right.
And I think, and I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, I'll be the first, I've admitted things to you about I'm wrong about. I'll be the first one to admit if I'm ever wrong about this. But as I said here today, knowing what I know right now at least, I think the answer to the question, what does love require of me? It requires an honest evaluation of where things have been, where things are now, and where I would like to see things in the future, as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
And that evaluation has led me to say, and it's why we did this a year ago, it led me to say, it's not okay to just not be racist. I have to be anti-racist. And I have to work to remove racism as much as I can in me, but in also everything that I have the ability to influence.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we always promise we're going to do this for an hour. So we could talk about this for a lot longer, I know.
Time flies when you're having fun, doesn't it?
But so parting shot for me real quick, and then we're going to wrap up. I think the most important thing is that we all just stay open-minded about it. And you guys have displayed that so well too, every time we've had these conversations, privately and publicly. Because there's a side of this that you don't understand too.
Correct.
You know? And there's a side that I don't understand.
Yeah.
And so I think that in love and in conversation, we have the ability through dialogue to both grow better.
Right.
And ultimately, that's what brings unity. Because unity is the thing that Jesus prayed for us to have. You know, when Jesus prayed about us as believers, he prayed that we would be unified.
Right.
That's right.
And so if nothing else, we don't even have to agree on everything.
Correct.
But if we can, as far as it depends on us, live at peace with everyone and seek to understand others and seek to love others as Jesus has loved us, knowing that we wouldn't behave well and disagree with him the whole time, right? It seems to me as a Jesus follower, that is, if that's as far as we get, that's going to take us a long way.
Right.
Agree.
Hey, thanks so much. I know I say this all the time. I really do love you guys. I so appreciate the relationship that we have formed, and thanks for being willing to sit in these conversations and be vulnerable. So
Thank you.
all right, well, appreciate you guys. Hey, thanks so much for joining us too.
Absolutely.